Abraham lived to the age of 175. Abraham took his last breath and died after a good long life, a content old man, and he was placed with his ancestors. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave in Machpelah, which is in the field of Zohar's son Ephron the Hittite, near Mamre. Thus Abraham and his wife Sarah were both buried in the field Abraham had purchased from the Hittites. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac lived and bare Lahai Roi. These are the descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore for Abraham. These are the names of Ishmael's sons, by their names and according to their birth order: Nebaioth, Ishmael's oldest son, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah.
Ever since Christianity began, Christians have argued over, well, everything really. We read the same scriptures in worship and sing often the same songs, and yet there are issues that still to this day divide many Christians. And one of those issues is what we are talking about today, which is the idea of being made right with God, of being a person who lives a life God calls us to live. Now, there's a big word that Christians use for that. The word is justification. It means basically, how are we justified? How are we made right with God? It's like when you justify your bank ledger, you're looking to see if all the charges that are there are correct and if you've made all your payments, that kind of thing. And the idea of justification has long been something we've argued about in the church. For example, what order does it happen in? Are you made right with God because you've done certain things, because you've acted in a particular way, because you've said the right words? Are you made right with God by an act of God, by grace? Or are you made right with God by faith, by works? Is there a particular thing that you need to say or do in order to be made right with God? And once you're made right with God, can you be made unright with God? Is it possible for you to be made unright, to no longer be justified with God? It's something we've argued about for centuries. We make it really complicated. Some denominations argue that if you don't come to church, if you don't go to church and you don't take communion and you don't get baptized, then you cannot be justified. You cannot be made right with God, and you can lose that made rightness with God. And some denominations argue that if you are made right with God because you've said, yes, I believe, then the things that you do, the way that you behave, the way that you act and talk and treat other people can make you unright with God. You can be kicked out. You can be made unfavored from God. Presbyterians have always had a sort of complicated relationship with the idea of justification. Calvin argued that we are made right with God, we are justified with God by an act of God, that our inclusion in the family of God is an act of grace. You see, Luther argued that our justification with God, our made rightness with God, is an act of grace. That God claimed you, named you, and brought you into the family as an act of grace. And that's all. That's all you need to be made right with God, is just that act of grace. And see, Presbyterians have always taken that one step further, that in order to be made right with God, we have grace. Yes, that God has poured out grace abundantly for the saved, for the people who are called by God. There is an abundance of that spirit of grace, but that we then will produce an act of faith. So you see, it's a step further, that grace will spark something in you, will make you want to seek God in some way. And so it's not the things that we do or say at that point that make you saved. It's that act of faith, that seeking of God in your life, that moment where you take the grace, you realize that grace has been poured out on you and takes you a step further. See, it makes it complicated. Are you confused? And I think that's probably because Paul always makes things a little confusing. Paul always takes something that seems to be simple on its face and makes it a little confusing. Our stories that we hear this morning, I think, are simple examples of what that justification, of that being made right with God looks like in our lives. See, Ruth and Naomi are not blood kin. They're not even of the same ethnic family. Naomi was a Hebrew, an Israelite, and she went with her family. She left with her family from Israel to go to Moab because there was a great famine in Israel. And so Naomi left as a child and went to this foreign place. And once there, she married a person, a Moabite. And she had 2 sons. And those 2 sons married other Moabites. You see how the story works? And one of those Moabites was Ruth, and the other was Orpah. And those sons died, which was fairly common in those days. And Naomi's husband also died. And so the only people who were left were Naomi and Ruth and Orpah. And Naomi looked around and realized she was in a foreign place, detached from the people that she knew. And so she decided to go home, to go back to her people, to a place where she felt comfortable and included and loved. And so she left Moab and she went home. And what she tried to do was to convince Ruth and Orpah to stay behind with their people. She thought it would be better for Ruth and for Orpah to stay at home where they could be cared for by their family. And it probably was better. Ruth probably would have been safer at home. Orpah definitely had more support at home. And so Naomi was trying to do what she thought was right. And Ruth prayed about it and considered it and decided that no, the right thing to do was for Ruth to put aside what may have been her own wants and her own needs at that point and do what was right for Naomi. To go with her and made sure she would make it home, and that when she got there was established and cared for and loved. It was an act of self-sacrifice. She said, I'm putting aside what's best for me and doing what is best for another. Similarly, we heard the story of Isaac and Ishmael. No 2 people had bigger disagreements in life than Isaac and Ishmael. They didn't. Ishmael was Abraham's son first and was born to Abraham's servant Hagar. And when Isaac was born, Sarah made Abraham send away Ishmael and Hagar into the desert, where God blessed them and said, you will be my people. And so there were 2 families, Isaac and Isaac's family, and Ishmael and his family. And they disagreed. They fought. They had bitter hatred and enmity with each other. And yet when Abraham dies, Isaac and Ishmael put those angers, those hatreds, those distrusts aside to come together and bury Abraham. And so it was an act of seeing what the other needed, what the other wanted, to put aside what was years of hatred and distrust of one another, to do what was best to do what was right, to do what God had called them to do. You see, these are both stories from the Old Testament of living out what Jesus told us in the New Testament was the one commandment we needed to follow in order to be right with God, to love our neighbors, to love the Lord our God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Simple. It's that simple, right? The first thing that we need to do when we receive that grace and we become aware of that grace is to love the Lord our God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's it. So all you have to do is seek God, to look for God, to try to find God in places and in your everyday. It's having a lens with which we can see God at work, to put aside our humanness, our human desires, our human thoughts and minds, and to seek the mind of God, to make God the most important thing in your life, to love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, Jesus says, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And this doesn't mean that it's complicated. That's a whole sermon in itself. But basically what it means is that we can see beyond our own needs of the time, that we can see beyond what may be best for us, what may be right for us, and to see what is right for another. To make a choice to live our lives in a way where we can be servants of all. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't practice self-care. That's the second part, as ourselves, right? That you have to have fuel for your journey. You have to take care of yourself. But it's about having a viewpoint, a mindset that is shaped by grace, that is shaped by the love of God in your life, by having a viewpoint that says that I am going to love others, that I'm going to put the needs of others before my own, that I'm going to look at the world with a lens that says, how do I love first? If I'm going to be a person of love, if I'm going to be a person who's made right with God, then I will look at the world through the eyes of love. Loving your neighbor as yourself is as simple as saying that what I want in this moment, what I need in this moment, may not be what's best. That maybe my opinion and my viewpoint on this issue may not be what's best for what God is creating and calling us to be in the future. It may not be what's best for another. And so we put aside some of what may be really valuable and important to us because we see that for another, there is another who needs something more, something different. When we keep these principles in mind, when we see it as loving God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and we see it, our lives as being something that is made by God to love another, it completely reframes how we view the world. So what does that mean? It means that when you hear a story on the news, you think, where do I see God in this? And how can I love another in this moment? How do I see God in this story? Where do I see God acting? How do I show God to others in this time? Those are the two questions, and that's really it. It's not really so much about how it impacts us, though that's important, but how do we in this time be the hands and feet of God in the world? It means seeing the beauty of the earth. It means that we see opportunity, that we see the resurrection in times of death and loss, that we see hope for tomorrow, that we know that we are loved, that we accept the love of another. And so we can make it complicated. We can make this Christian life complicated and come up with lists of rules and things that we're supposed to do and say in ways that we're supposed to be. But really, in the end, what we're called to do is to be like Ruth and to say, what is the need of another in this time? What is the way that I can serve? And in the end, maybe be blessed by that service. It's by acting like Isaac and Ishmael and not getting so wrapped up in our own needs and wants and thoughts and hatreds and angers and whatever, that we can't see what is the greater purpose and the greater good. It's as simple and as complicated as all that.